Hey groupers, welcome to the new year and getting back into our small groups. How did it go this week for you in our Jeopardy game? Did you get any questions correct? Did you answer any out loud? Did you answer any out loud and you were incorrect? It's always hard being on the spot. How many did you know? I'll tell you the truth. The truth is that if you just study this passage, you will have a great grip on the Old Testament. There's a lot of people that say that they just don't know the Old Testament very well. Well, if you study this passage of Scripture, you'll have a great grip on the Old Testament. Well, we're focusing in on one of the servants that had been mentioned in the previous passage, Stephen. And it says in this passage that he argued with the Jews, and they could not stand up against his wisdom. I'm wondering how many of you that your story aligns with that statement. That there was someone in your life that used apologetics. Apologetics is the defense or the proof of Christianity. That someone argued with you and they convinced you that Christianity is true. They convinced you to come and to believe. Maybe they convinced you to come back and believe. I just wonder if in your group you would just talk a little bit about if that applied to your life, if there was someone in your life that used convincing proofs to bring you to a place of belief. I have always been an arguer, but that's a bad term. I've always been a debater. My dad wanted me to be a lawyer. He said that he couldn't win an argument against me, and so I should make money with this skill. I was in debate when I was in high school, and my debate teacher, Mr. Whipple, to be perfectly honest with you, he was a very, very pagan man. And he brought a lot of his pretty off-color stuff into our debate team. Here I was, a Christ follower, and I remember at the end, when I graduated from high school, Mr. Whipple said to me, he said, if you ever get a church in San Antonio, you call me and I'll come and listen to you preach. Well, obviously I don't live in San Antonio, and I know now that Mr. Whipple went on to become a professor of debate at the University of Chicago. But I just remember that we argued a lot, and somewhere along the way I hope that I planted some seeds. I think that's what Stephen did. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Well, Stephen was arrested, and they had false charges that were brought against him, just like they did against Jesus. So the next thing that I want you just to look at in the text is, what were these false charges? And were any of these parallel to the charges that they brought against Jesus? You might have to look back into the Gospels to answer that question. What were the charges they brought against Stephen, and were any of these charges brought against Jesus? Well, in verse 15, it says that his face appeared like an angel. It means that it was glowing. He radiated glory. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 34 and read verses 29 through 35, and you'll read the original story about a human being whose face glowed. And then I'd like you to turn to the New Testament, and Paul talks about this original story in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. And Paul talks about it. So what I'm wanting you to answer is, first, who is the first person that experiences this angel glowing glory face? What does Paul say about the subject? And then why do you think that God performed this miracle for Stephen here in this passage in Acts chapter 6? Why now in the life of the church do we see this again? Next, at the end, before Stephen is stoned, it says that he accused them of being a stiff-necked people. So what I want you to do is I want you just to look up a few passages in the Bible where this term is used. Stephen is not the creator of this term. So first, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 32, verse 9, and who is the first person to speak this term in the Bible? Who speaks this title, this accusation first, and whom is it against? And then I want you to turn to 2 Kings chapter 17, read verses 13 through 15. Who makes the statement here? Whom is it against? Who is called the stiff-necked people in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 13? Who is called stiff-necked there? And then in Jeremiah, and to be honest with you, these are just a handful of the times that this phrase occurs in the Old Testament. But in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 23, The prophet, of course, speaking for God, uses this title again. To whom is it used in this passage? Well, Stephen uses it in this passage, and the leadership responds. How did they respond to the accusation that they were a stiff-necked people? And then, have you ever lost your temper? Have you ever lost your temper and been out of your mind? Because it appears to me that these guys are out of their mind. They are so incensed that they have lost reason. Have you ever lost your temper in such a way that you feel like you were out of your mind? I remember I watched a good friend of mine throw a tire iron about 50 yards over a fence on the side of the highway after it came off of the lug nut that he couldn't get loose. He was out of his mind, and we saw it fly through the air in slow motion over a barbed wire fence where we, of course, eventually had to go get it. What about you? Finally, Stephen uses the term Son of Man when he sees Jesus standing next to the Father. And Jesus used this term for himself more than any other title. This was Jesus' most preferred title for himself, Son of Man. And this is the last time that the title occurs in the Bible, which is usually significant. It comes from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. You've already had your Old Testament open a lot, so let's open it one more time and read it in Daniel. It's a prophecy about Jesus, and I want you to read it and know that I believe that it is clearly fulfilled in the first coming of Christ. That seems to me what Stephen is saying, that the Son of Man has now been given all of this authority that it talks about in Daniel chapter 7. Well, every week I challenge you to talk about what you like in the passage, what your favorite thing is, what is your least favorite thing, and then we remind each other of our application. Well, I don't think it's a surprise to you that I like Stephen. What I really like is that he is confounding them, and I think that he's confounding Saul. I think that Saul is in this crowd, Saul who's going to become Paul. We're just about to get to that in the book of Acts. I think that Stephen is planting seeds for the harvest that is about to come in Saul's life, and I really like that. Because I like an argument that changes people. It's just who I am. Well, what do I not like? Obviously, I don't like the first martyr, the first death of a Christian because of what they believe. Application. This week I challenged you to think about somebody in your life that you've lost your temper with and that they need your forgiveness. Someone in your life that needs to be forgiven. The leaders of the Israelites needed to forgive Stephen and listen to him, but they were closing their ears, covering their eyes. And I bet that happens in our life sometimes. So whom is God calling you to forgive? Well, I hope that you have a great study, beautiful passage, and I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.